said on that debate stage are going to impact your retirement. They're going to impact your kids' education. They're going to impact infrastructure.
Kamala Harris's policies are a disaster, ladies and gentlemen, not just for truckers, but for everybody who relies on them, which is everybody.
Because you're just donating money to them and then saying there's going to be a ceasefire. So it just kind of confuses us and puts us right in the middle.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate Governor Tim Walz hitting the campaign trail in Georgia today. They arrived in Savannah, Georgia a short time ago. They're heading out on a bus tour across the Peach State and will rally in Savannah, Georgia on Thursday. This is the first time they've hit the road since the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And on the Republican side, former President Donald Trump's campaign is facing some controversy. Arlington National Cemetery now says that 2 members of Trump's campaign were involved in an altercation while the former president participated in a ceremony there on Monday. Let's start with our Nancy Cordes, who is following the Harris campaign down in Georgia. Nancy, great to see you. I can't imagine how hot it is down there. How hot's the political scene?
Well, it's definitely heating up, Bob, and I'll tell you why. It's because just about a month and a half ago, our CBS News poll, other polls showed that President Biden, when he was still in this race, was trailing Donald Trump pretty significantly in this state, despite the fact that Biden won this state back in 2020. But now, according to our latest battleground tracker, Vice President Harris, who is at the top of the ticket, is actually neck and neck with Donald Trump. So the Harris campaign feels that this state is very much up for grabs. Both she and her vice presidential running mate, Governor Tim Walz, arrived here in Georgia this afternoon. They're going to be hitting this, various stops around southeastern Georgia for the next 2 days on a bus tour culminating here in Savannah with a rally, by the way, which had to be rescheduled from a few weeks ago. They were planning to do it right after announcing Walz as Harris's running mate, but they had to postpone it because of Hurricane Debbie that was lashing the state at that time. And so this is kind of a do-over.
Beyond the stump speeches and the bus tour, what are you hearing from the Harris campaign about the message they're starting to push on advertising in particular?
Well, they've got a new ad out today, Bob, that is all about Project 2025. They continue to hammer Trump over this massive 900-page blueprint that basically is a very conservative vision for the next Republican president of the United States. Trump has disavowed it. He says he had nothing to do with it. He didn't craft it, but the people who did craft it worked in his administration, and a lot of the policies they put forward in Project 2025 mirror policies from his first administration or mirror policies that he has put forward as part of this campaign. So it's been difficult for him to distance himself from Project 2025, and the Harris campaign is going to make sure that it stays a subject of conversation between now and Election Day. They have noticed that it really resonates with their base voters in particular, and their new ad basically lays out a number of the more controversial things that Project 2025 would do, like downsizing the education department, cutting funding for K through 12 schools, new policies regarding abortion. And they are arguing that not only does Trump know about this plan, but that he is intimately involved with it.
For those of us, for those watching and joining us today, let's show you a snippet of this ad, and you can judge for yourself whether it's effective.
Defunding K through 12 schools, requiring the government to monitor women's pregnancies, and severe cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Donald Trump may try to deny it, but those are Donald Trump's plans.
Well, revenge does take time.
Nancy, that's the Project 2025 message. We heard that from President Biden for months while he was still in the presidential race.
Yep.
What about President Biden? As our chief White House correspondent, what's going to be his role in the coming few weeks? I know he's in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware with his family today, but where does he go from here?
Right, he's been keeping a very low profile. He's been on vacation in Rehoboth Beach all week. Before that, he was on vacation in California. He does say that he's going to continue to hit the trail with Vice President Harris, with Tim Walz. I'm sure we will see him from time to time, particularly in Pennsylvania. As you know, he claims Pennsylvania as his home state in a way, next to his beloved Delaware, because he grew up there. So I'm sure we'll see him on the trail in Pennsylvania, at least, probably other states as well. But he really is trying, Bob, to cede the spotlight as much as possible to Vice President Harris, especially because it is now such a sprint to the finish line. She's got less than 70 days to establish herself as the candidate, to make sure that the American people get to know her. And as one step in that process, she is going to be doing her first sit-down interview as the candidate tomorrow. She will have her vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, at her side when she does that interview.
That's right. Our friend Dana Bash over there will conduct that interview. Nancy, I hope you get a chance to enjoy Savannah. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob.
Now to the latest developments on that alleged altercation between Arlington National Cemetery staff and members of the Trump campaign. For more, we're joined now by CBS News Pentagon reporter and producer Ellie Watson. Ellie, great to have you here on America Decides. So you cover the Pentagon so closely. They help oversee Arlington National Cemetery, such a sacred spot in this country. What are the facts, at least what we know at this point, about what happened? I was actually at Arlington National Cemetery keeping an eye on that ceremony. I did not see what happened over in Section 60 where this altercation occurred. I was just there by the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, so didn't see it. But what have we learned about what actually happened over there in Section 60, which is really a spot that has a lot of sensitivity because recent service members killed are buried there?
Right. Well, we do know that the cemetery has filed an incident report, and defense officials tell us that's because members of the Trump campaign staff were aggressive both physically and verbally towards a cemetery staffer. That staffer was trying to enforce rules that prohibit campaigns from filming at grave sites across the cemetery, but especially at Section 60. Section 60, as you noted, is an emotional spot in the cemetery for so many because it is where many young veterans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan are buried. The Trump campaign denies that any incident occurred and that the campaign had explicit permission from the families to be in Section 60. However, federal law, according to the cemetery, dictates those guidelines, and the cemetery staff is very strict at enforcing them so that the burial sites of so many veterans who have sacrificed their lives under administrations, regardless of party, are not used as political props.
Ellie, help us understand the dynamics here. You have a former commander-in-chief, not just a former president, but he's, as we all know, also the commander-in-chief at Arlington National Cemetery. So he is a former military official, in effect, as a former president of the United States. You have Arlington National Cemetery, the Defense Department. How is something like this adjudicated inside of the federal government, inside the Pentagon, if at all?
We do know that that incident report has been filed. The cemetery says they're not going to release any more information because they do want to protect the identity of the individual involved. But you can be sure that many news organizations will request that incident report from the Pentagon, from the local police departments through the Freedom of Information Act.
Ellie, you're busy covering the Pentagon. Other colleagues of ours are busy covering the political scene. And Senator J.D. Vance, former President Trump's running mate, has weighed in on this altercation today. Let's listen.
I think, first of all, the altercation at Arlington Cemetery is the media creating a story where I really don't think that there is one. There is verifiable evidence. There is verifiable evidence that the campaign was allowed to have a photographer there. There's verifiable, they were invited to have a photographer there. There's verifiable evidence that the families of these poor people who had their loved ones die 3 years ago at Abbey Road, Abbey Gate, those 13 Americans, a lot of them were there with the president. They invited him to be there.
Ellie, can you help us get some context here when Senator Vance references Abbey Gate? What exactly happened at the airport in Afghanistan in 2021?
Right, so Monday did mark 3 years since a suicide bombing at the airport in Kabul killed 13 U.S. service members during the final days of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Former President Trump was at Arlington with some of the Gold Star families and some of the Marines who survived that bombing in 2021. Former President Trump has really seized on the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan as exhibit number one of the weaknesses of a Biden-Harris foreign policy. The Biden administration has pushed back, saying that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was inevitable once the Trump administration cut a deal with the Taliban. It's worth remembering that former President Trump does have a track record of making demeaning comments about military service members, including calling those captured or killed suckers and losers. So his appearance at Arlington on Monday could have been a controversy under any circumstances, even if we weren't in the final stages of this election season.
Ellie Watson, we appreciate your time in reporting. Former President Trump has repeatedly denied that he made those comments. And we'll now turn to the Middle East, where Israeli forces have launched a major operation in the West Bank. At least 10 Hamas fighters have been killed. Israeli forces sealed off a city known to be a militant stronghold. A military official also confirmed that large forces entered several cities in the occupied territory, including a refugee camp. Let's go to Imtiaz Tayeb, who is inside the West Bank with the latest. Imtiaz, thanks for joining us. What can you tell us?
We're here in one of several villages in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, Palestinian villages where the situation is extremely tense following Israel's decision to launch what's being described as one of the largest operations it's conducted here in the West Bank in decades. You can, of course, see behind me that there are some tires burning, and it really just underscores just how tense the situation here is. We've been speaking to some of the residents who tell us that Israeli trucks have been coming up and down this road, and that in one house down there that they have taken Palestinians to interrogate. Now, in the background of all of this, the Biden administration has announced that it is sanctioning an Israeli NGO that it says provides support to illegal outposts, what's being described as illegal outposts here in the West Bank, that is responsible for some of the violence that we've been seeing against Palestinians. Whatever the case, as we've been saying, this major operation that the Israelis are carrying out here in the West Bank, they say that this is just the beginning.
Imtiaz Tayeb, thank you.
The awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American.
Red, white, and blue in political messaging. How Vice President Kamala Harris's country first message is now shaping her campaign with this infamous emphasis on patriotism. You're streaming America Decides.
Fellow Americans, I love our country with all my heart. Everywhere I go, in everyone I meet, I see a nation that is ready to move forward.
As you just heard, Vice President Kamala Harris focusing on patriotism as she makes her introduction to the country at the Democratic National Convention and in the days since. Joining us now is Peter Hamby, great journalist and the founding partner at Puck. He's also the host of Snapchat's Good Luck America. Peter, you've covered campaigns for a long time, and you have a good ear. What do you hear when you hear her going down this path rhetorically?
Bob, thanks for having me. Good to see you last week in Chicago as well. What I hear is in keeping with some of what you were just talking about in the first segment of the show, which is Kamala Harris leaning into her weaknesses, trying to turn them on their head, and turn them into a strength for her campaign. Perceived weaknesses, I should say. So think about what she's been doing since she launched the campaign. She is perceived, according to polls, as soft on border security and immigration. What do we see in their first ad? Her talking about how she's a tough on crime prosecutor who's going to go after drug traffickers. There are perceptions in polls that she is too liberal. Republicans would call her a Bay Area socialist. So she completely disavows co-sponsoring a Medicare for All bill in Congress, in the Senate, with Bernie Sanders. And with this messaging, I don't think anyone thinks that Kamala Harris isn't a patriot, but Democrats have always, suffered, at least in polling, against Republicans as being seen as the party that isn't as patriotic. They aren't the party that supports a strong national defense. Republicans are the party that traditionally wraps themselves in the American flag. They are the party of Ronald Reagan and his shining city on a hill. And I think what the Harris campaign is doing is just playing offense. They're playing to win. Whether it means flip-flopping on certain issues or just embracing this patriotism line, this country first messaging, which was literally John McCain's campaign message in 2008, the Vietnam War veteran. If there are perceptions out there, Bob, of her being a Bay Area liberal, a half black, half South Asian woman, if there are doubts about her becoming president, look, this might be just something that people talk about in the dark corners of the right-wing internet, but she's really trying to rally Americans and swing voters to her side. The North Star of this campaign, it's very clear so far, are moderate swing voters, and she is trying to claim that she is the patriot, not Donald Trump, who wants to cozy up to dictators, that Kamala Harris is the party that wants to secure your freedoms, whereas Donald Trump wants to take them away. I think it's, from a political tactic and strategy perspective, pretty smart of her. And we're seeing in polling, Puck just did a poll, Bob, with Echelon Insights, showing that Kamala Harris is actually competitive with Trump at parity on questions like who would be the strongest leader, who would best manage a crisis. Those are issues in polls, attributes that typically favor Republicans. And now Kamala Harris is keeping pace with Donald Trump on them. I find that pretty remarkable.
Let's dig a little bit deeper into that poll. Earlier in this campaign, we heard about Brat, Charlie XCX, the British pop singer, and there was kind of this overture to people who are into that side of pop culture and music. Let's look at the poll, though. 36% of voters, when asked, how would you feel if somebody told you you were Brat, 36% were offended, 24% confused, 20% unsure. I joined the unsure. But what do you make of the summer of Brat, and is it over, politically speaking?
I love the Charlie XCX album. It's my album of the summer, Bob. I would take it as a compliment if someone out here in Los Angeles said I was Brat. I don't think anyone's doing that to me. This poll question I thought was interesting because it gets to the sort of media narrative versus public opinion, the very online class of people, and maybe the normies out there. Perhaps those swing voters I just mentioned who live outside of Philadelphia and Bucks County, who might not know what Brat is. Look, I think very clearly, we've been talking about this for 6 weeks now, Kamala Harris has captured the attention of the internet and social media, and importantly, pivoted sentiment around the Democratic ticket in a positive direction compared to Joe Biden. But if you know what Brat is, that means you might be spending a lot of time online, on TikTok. There's this whole saying in politics over the last 8 years that Twitter is not real life. Most Americans aren't even on Twitter. Fewer than that are posting on Twitter. Turns out TikTok's not real life either. We also asked if people were familiar with any memes about the election. Turns out only 1 or 2% of Americans, likely voters in this poll, were familiar with the coconut pill memes or the Brat memes. So it's all good for Kamala Harris, but they can't assume that Brat is going to win them the election.
And quickly, Peter, I have to ask you, Puck is known for not only covering politics, but covering the media. What are you watching for when VP Harris and Governor Walz sit down with Dana Bash on Thursday in Georgia?
I love Dana Bash, great journalist, mentor of mine from my days at CNN. I think what I'm interested to see, actually, are not the very tight questions about specifics. In the past where Kamala Harris has stumbled, actually, it's on very open-ended questions. How do you feel about X? How do you feel about Y? That was the case back in 2019 and 2020, at least. I interviewed her in March, Bob. I thought she was actually greatly improved from the last time she did a lot of media interviews back in a campaign context in 2020. So I think we'll see some of those questions from Dana. I'm also interested to see if she stumbles, does she just throw it to Tim Walz? Like, having the two of them in an interview setting is an advantage for both Harris and Walz because they can play off each other rather than a one-to-one setting between Dana and one of the candidates. So we'll see if Kamala Harris does any solo interviews after this one.
Peter Hamby, always great to see you. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Bob.
And we're seeing for the first time newly released video from the January 6th assault on the Capitol. The in-the-moment comments from then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. That's coming up next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. New video from the aftermath of January 6th is now revealing more of then Speaker Nancy Pelosi's response to the Capitol riot. The footage was turned over to Congress by HBO and obtained by CBS News.
We take an oath to protect our country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. There is a domestic enemy in the White House.
Scott McFarland joins us now. Scott, thanks for being here. Why does this video matter? You've been covering this issue for a long time. What stands out to you?
A whole bunch of things in this video, and one of which explains why it was released. Nancy Pelosi is heard in this video saying that Donald Trump is a domestic enemy in the White House. Pretty powerful. Heard talking about prompt impeachment or having the cabinet galvanized to invoke the 25th Amendment. And then she's blasting the Capitol security officials who unequivocally failed January 6th. The then Capitol Police Chief, the then House Sergeant at Arms, and then says in one clip that she takes responsibility for that. And there it is. That's why this has been released, not just by congressional Republicans, but preemptively by congressional Democrats. They sent out this video ahead of a news release Republicans issued saying, look, Nancy Pelosi's accepting responsibility for January 6th, just as Donald Trump has blamed her. Congressional Democrats put out all the video. To put it in context, she takes responsibility as a leader of Congress for the failures of others. Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate leader, he shared responsibility for oversight of Capitol security January 6th.
What are we learning, Scott, about discussions over the National Guard?
The National Guard was the responsibility of the Trump administration to call up. Washington, D.C.'s National Guard is a little different than the state National Guards. A governor calls up a state National Guard. D.C.'s mayor doesn't have that power. It has to be the Trump administration. And in those videos, you hear Nancy Pelosi saying, why isn't the Guard here already? Why wasn't the Guard pre-mobilized? What took so long for the Guard to get called? It took hours before they showed up after the rioting began. You hear her viscerally frustrated about their absence. That's an issue the January 6th Select Committee brought up voluminously in their investigations.
Let's listen to that clip about the National Guard.
How many times did the members ask, are we prepared? Are we prepared? We're not. Prepared for the worst. We're calling the National Guard now. Should have been here to start out.
Are we hearing anything from former Speaker Pelosi or people close to her about how they see this footage?
The Democrats who shared the video with CBS News and who alerted us to its existence have been pretty clear as they've made the argument that there were failures on January 6th of many kinds and that the security failures deserve a good review, and the House subcommittee that's there now is doing so. But that there was one way to get the rioters to leave. Donald Trump could have encouraged them, if not directed them to leave. And famously, you'll recall, it took 187 minutes from the start of the riot for Trump to do so. This is what it feels like to me. The House Republicans put out a press release today using that clip of Nancy Pelosi. Feels like they're queuing that up potentially for Donald Trump to cite when asked about January 6th on the stump or at that September 10th presidential debate.
And before we let you go, Scott, turning to a different side of the January 6th story, Special Counsel Jack Smith indicting former President Trump, narrowing the charges from his previous indictment on this front. As someone who has covered Jack Smith for a long time, covered that January 6th case, what's your assessment of where the case stands and what you're watching next, especially as September approaches?
A couple key deadlines. There need to be court filings from both sides by the end of this week with their expected next steps in the case. That includes the defense. A week from tomorrow, there's a hearing, a status conference for both sides to get in front of the judge and explain what happens next. But some of that could get twisted or changed based on this new superseding indictment if they try to have a proceeding on that issue first. But here's the bottom line, Bob. Clearly, Jack Smith is no longer in a hurry. He has taken his foot off the gas pedal. He even allowed one deadline to slip and saying he needed more time. November 5th is not a date that's on his radar. This case, if it exists, Donald Trump does not win re-election, will move at its own pace now.
Scott McFarland, always on top of it. We really appreciate it. Now, turning to Georgia, back to Georgia. We began there. We turn there again. A state with tight margins in the 2020 election. And now the Harris campaign is really trying to get voters on board. A look at their strategy coming up next with our political panel. You are streaming America Decides. Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz hitting the road today for a two-day bus tour in the battleground state of Georgia. We're joined now by Leslie Sanchez and Chuck Rocha. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and a Republican strategist. Chuck is the founder and president of Solidarity Strategies. He's also a Democratic strategist who previously served as a senior advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders and his presidential campaigns in 2016 and 2020. Great to have both of you here. Let's look at some of the polling. You look in Georgia right now. It's a tight race, 49%, 49%, based on CBS News' latest estimate, and among likely voters. And we can bring that up on screen. We can show you that. And then among Hispanic voters, this is what we're seeing nationally. Kamala Harris, the vice president, at 58%. Former President Trump at 41%. What explains the gap? And we'll begin with you, Leslie, on the 58 to 41 number there among Hispanic voters.
I'd say that Harris is underperforming with Hispanic voters for the Democratic side. Traditionally, if Democrats are in around 64%, they win in terms of the Latino vote in those swing areas. Republicans have averaged about 31.5% for the last 11 presidential elections. When you get into the 40 territory, that's a winning number in Arizona, Nevada, moving along the Sun Belt states. So the real question is, as the Latino voter is changing, they're younger, they're bicultural, they are, English and Spanish dominant, and they're just not the 1980s or 1990s Latino voter. I think it's becoming more of a challenge for campaigns to connect with them.
And just a quick follow-up with you, Leslie. Former President Trump is proposing mass deportations if he wins the White House. How's that affecting the conversation in that community?
It depends where you're talking. If you're talking about Texas, an area that has third, fourth generation Latino voters, they're very supportive. Overwhelmingly, I'd say 60%, two-thirds support the idea of doing that. Even some soft conservative Democrats, because they feel like they've been overrun by undocumented aliens in other areas. And I think that's consistent you're seeing along the U.S.-Mexico border. But if you go to somewhere like Georgia or North Carolina, it's going to have a different type of attitude. You have a different sensibility, a different cultural attachment, and they're not so aligned or close to the border. So it's not going to be maybe 64%, but maybe half and half.
Chuck, at the Democratic National Convention, Vice President Harris, and in some of her advertising too, has talked about being someone who was tough on border policy when she was in California as the Attorney General, as a prosecutor. How does that messaging affecting core Democratic voters, especially messaging? When you look at her 2019-2020 campaign, some Democrats and progressives didn't love her position and past record on immigration. How do they see it now and the way she's framing that issue?
I think there's a reason why you've seen the numbers move to the positive to where they were compared to where Joe Biden was. This election is not going to be a national election. We look at national polls to get theories and to see what trend lines are doing. You cover that, I've covered that. But the real election is going to come down to just 7 states. And in those states, 85% of the people have already made up their mind. So she's talking to just that small sliver of people in the middle who do think 2 things. They think there should be a pathway to citizenship, but they also believe we should have a secure border. And I think she's trying to walk that line. You saw it at the convention. You see it in Senate races like Ruben Gallego. You're going to see that as a common thread with Latinos and with Democrats trying to get to that persuadable universe of voters.
Just real quick with Chuck, you mentioned Ruben Gallego, his Senate race in Arizona. Why is he doing well in the polling based on your evaluation?
He's a Marine. He grew up in a blue-collar family. He worked in kitchens when he was young. He didn't sleep on a bed till he went to college because he had to give his bedroom to his 3 sisters. That's a real American story. Whether you came from Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, Puerto Rican, and there's so many Mexicans in Arizona, they can relate with this guy and say, look, he may be a Democrat, I may be an independent or a moderate Republican, but I like that guy. That's why he's doing well.
It's interesting when you're talking about on the state level. So Trump is performing 5-6 points higher than the Republican Senate candidates in those competitive races. And it's because of stories like that, relatable to the community, has longstanding ties. And I think the question that really Democrats fall into is things like social services. And Hillary Clinton ran into that when you're talking about driver's licenses for undocumented aliens. That was a really difficult issue to kind of swallow down a ballot. They had a difficult time politically. You're talking about driver's license again, or any of those, you know, access to housing, access to health care for undocumented aliens. I think it poses a very difficult question.
Whenever I go down to Atlanta, Georgia, and just explore Georgia as a reporter, I'm always struck by how Georgia's changing. People talk about Georgia sometimes in politics as a state with white population and a black population, but it has a growing Asian American community. It has a growing Hispanic community, especially you go to some suburbs of Atlanta, a strong, vibrant Hispanic community. How do you see Georgia and how Democrats are really trying to pull together different constituencies to make a winning coalition?
It's the only reason she's down there right now. There's 1 million Latinos that live in Georgia. Latinos are a big part of the fabric of that. They've elected Latinos now to the state house, city government, the AAPI community, growing. But what you're going to see her do, and there's a reason why, me and you've covered campaigns and been part of campaigns for a long time. Watch where they go. That tells you where the polling tells you. She wouldn't be there if she couldn't win. They would not waste the time. There's one thing, I've run a presidential campaign, you never get back, which is time and money. She's there because there's a pathway. There's a pathway that wasn't there under Joe Biden. And a lot of that has to do with these voters of color in this state. And when she tells the story, you'll see her lean into being an immigrant family who made and got to experience the American dream. That's something that cuts across all party lines, but especially with young voters of color. And in Georgia, there's a newer population of just first-generation Latinos that are unlike Nevada and Arizona that are second and third generation.
Just final thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's the new Latino South. It's those outer suburbs, or, you know, exurbs that are really bicultural. You have a lot of intermarriage, you have a lot of bilingualism, and first generation.
And a lot of Mexicans that wear cowboy hats like me.
A lot of Mexicans that wear cowboy hats.
I thought you were the only cowboy hat person I've seen in Washington, D.C.
Well, they're getting elected. They're getting elected right now as Democrats, and it's an opportunity, I would say, for both sides.
But Chuck, you didn't bring your cowboy hat today.
I'll bring it next time, I promise.
We didn't ask for that.
I'll bring my cowboy hat. There we go.
All right, Leslie and Chuck, thanks for stopping by. We appreciate it. The Harris campaign making a play for the hotly contested battleground state, not just of Georgia, but North Carolina. We'll take a look at the latest rankings by our friends at the Cook Political Report. You're streaming America Decides. A nonpartisan political analysis of the 2024 election finds support for Vice President Harris growing across the United States. The Cook Political Report with Amy Walter has shifted both Minnesota and New Hampshire from leaning Democrat to likely Democrat in the presidential race. The battleground state of North Carolina has also moved from leaning Republican to toss-up. Jessica Taylor is here to further discuss all of this. She is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Great to have you here, Jessica. Let's look at this Cook map. Let's begin with that and bring it up if you don't mind. 3 states are now shifting towards Vice President Harris based on your analysis. What are you seeing in Minnesota, in North Carolina, and New Hampshire?
So Minnesota and New Hampshire were states that sort of after Biden's collapse and that Democrats were newly worried about and that the Trump campaign had sort of identified as those expansion states. I think clearly with the shift we've seen in the past 5 weeks that the Trump campaign is focusing on these sort of 7 core battlegrounds. And so we shifted those ratings back toward Democrats. But I think the biggest one is that North Carolina, which the Biden campaign had talked about sort of wanting to put it sort of in the competitive ethos and things, but really it's taken Harris to really make this a battleground. And so we've seen significant shifts, I think, with enthusiasm among black voters, among younger voters. And the polls that we have seen show this very much to be a toss-up contest. And so you can, and you were talking about, I know, with Alaska, it's like, just look where they're going. Harris was in North Carolina the Friday before the convention. Trump has just been there. They're heading back there frequently. So I think you can see the Trump campaign shifting more money toward ad reservations there. So I think it is certainly competitive. And, you know, at the DNC last week, I heard Governor Roy Cooper talk many times. He kept repeating, which a lot of Democrats did, but like in North Carolina specifically, he said it feels like 2008 again, which is, of course, the last time that a Democrat won it, Barack Obama.
It was so telling to see Governor Cooper be the last person to be on the convention stage before Vice President Harris came out. There was no secret guest. There was no special performance. There was just North Carolina's governor. That was a political tell.
I briefly thought that Roy Cooper might introduce Beyonce, but clearly that didn't happen. But I think it showed just how important this is. And, you know, Cooper was in the vice presidential mix. He took himself out, but I think he's someone that's sort of been he's had the secret sauce to win 2 gubernatorial elections there, even as Trump carried the state both times. And I think he's, you know, they're both former attorney generals. So I think that just underscored how serious that the Harris campaign really believes that the state is in play.
For people who don't follow Governor Cooper closely, what is the secret sauce in your view? What has he done to win in North Carolina, even though it's been a tough state for Democrats?
He's been able to have an appeal in the rural areas, and I think he's been able to sort of energize black voters as well. You know, when we're looking at sort of the new battleground map, I think after Harris, you know, in the past few recent weeks, we also moved Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada that had been in our lean Republican column back to toss-up. I think North Carolina is, you know, a geographical proximity. It kind of gets compared, both in the South, it gets compared to Georgia. North Carolina is a little more difficult because it does have a lower African-American population and it has more rural whites. I think Cooper is someone that's been able to speak to those rural whites on issues. You know, he's been stalwartly pro-choice, but he's pushed for Medicaid expansion. And so I think he's not been afraid to go into those rural areas, and so I think that's something that he can help Harris with. I think it does come down to not only energizing African-American voters, but Cooper has also been able to win over some black voters in urban areas and suburbs that national Democrats have not, that Trump was able to win. So we saw that crossover vote happening in 2020. He won by about 4.5 points, even as Biden lost the state. So there's some crossover voters there. So, you know, he's term limited, but and there's a hot race for his seat as well. But I think if him campaigning with Harris certainly helps, and having that up and down the ticket.
Let's talk about that hot race for governor. How is that affecting the political wins in North Carolina?
This race is one that Democrats are defending with Cooper there, you know, but North Carolina voters have split their ticket on governor, and I think fundamentally voters do look at a race for governor differently than a race for a federal office such as president or Senate. And in fact, in the past century, there have only been 3 Republican governors. So the Democratic Attorney General, the same office Cooper held before he was elected, is Josh Stein, and the Republican is Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. Stein, you know, this was a race that we also saw close really in the spring, and we did a poll there in May, and it was a tied race. Our latest poll shows Stein up 8 points, 48-40, and that mirrors other public polling that we've seen. Robinson is someone who's certainly a controversial figure. He sort of rose up in the, you know, MAGA rise in the state. He had this viral speech to the Greensboro School Board and was really a surprise in the lieutenant governor's primary and winning that race. But I think a lot of voters don't pay attention to some of those, you know, down ballot constitutional races. He said a lot of controversial things about women, about LGBTQ individuals, and so we're seeing Stein has been able to really make an issue of that, particularly on abortion, where Robinson is now trying to defend his position. In fact, his latest ad had his wife trying to soften his image.
Jessica Taylor, great analysis. Thanks for being here. The University of Michigan's home opener is this weekend, but how do voters in the Wolverine state feel about the state of play in the presidential race? We're listening to them. That's coming up next. So college football is top of mind in Michigan right now. The Wolverines are kicking off their season on Saturday. I'm rooting for Notre Dame this season, but people in Michigan are rooting for Michigan State, Michigan Wolverines, and voters there are also taking some time, at least this summer, to weigh in on the state of the presidential race. To talk about that side of Michigan in the industrial Midwest, we have Jake Rosen with us, who is in Ann Arbor, home of the University of Michigan. Jake, great to see you. Looks like you're in a swamp, so we can keep this brief so you can stay safe out there with all the mosquitoes. What are you hearing from the college students you're talking to?
Hey, Bob, thank you for having me. As you know, the war in Gaza has been a critical issue for Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters, not in a state like Michigan, not just in a state like Michigan that has tons of people who are concerned about this and colleges, but also all across the country. And when we spoke with voters in the Detroit metro area this week, here's what they had to say.
You know, a lot of people have been hurt over the past year in Gaza, and she hasn't done a lot to recognize that.
I live in a community filled with a bunch of Arabs and Muslims, and we all feel the same way because what's happening back in Palestine. We all think we need a ceasefire, and then really, some politics say they're going to help make a change, but we haven't seen anything so far.
I think the change in the Democratic presidential candidate is really encouraging. I'm really excited about it. So I'm feeling a lot different about this election than I was a couple weeks ago.
And like you heard, Bob, some of those supporters who are likely to lean Democratic are just not satisfied with the position of the Biden and now Harris campaign on those issues. We spoke to another voter, however, who said that the change at the top of the ticket was welcome in order to stop Donald Trump from winning the presidency.
I don't want to abstain from voting entirely because if Trump gets elected, then it feels very much like something that I could have had a part in preventing. And so yeah, I just don't think that I have a choice, really.
So, Bob, we'll have to see exactly what happens with these young voters, but a campus like here in Ann Arbor and University of Michigan, Michigan State, and Wayne State University in Detroit are going to be critical. What happens when students return to campus like they did just here this week in terms of protests and how those students activate and vote come November?
It's so interesting, Jake. When I talk to people close to the Harris campaign, they're hoping for a ceasefire deal will somehow assure some of those voters you spoke with that Vice President Harris is on the same page with them. They hoped her speech at the convention did some of that. But there is an intriguing part of this conversation about the youth vote that's out there. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Trump campaign believes his endorsement is going to be helpful for voters out there, maybe younger voters who feel like they want an outsider to be on top of the ticket. How are you seeing the RFK endorsement playing in Michigan?
Well, that's right. Just like you said, the Trump campaign touted Kennedy's support for them and endorsement as a boost to their campaign. But one drawback to that here and in neighboring Wisconsin is that it is too late for RFK to get off the ballot here. So even those people who are on the fence or were supporting him can still cast a protest vote. Now, listen to one supporter who said that he was going to switch to support Donald Trump instead of supporting Robert F. Kennedy.
He's supporting Trump, so it's like, I'm going to have to, go with Trump, I guess.
And when asked why exactly he was going to switch his support, here's what that voter had to say.
I just gravitate towards Trump a little more. I don't know why. It's just like an energy thing, Sure. Yeah. He's very confident, right? Very confident.
And as we know, this is a critical part of the population that Donald Trump is aiming to court. Those people who are not trustful of the government, maybe because of COVID, maybe because of other issues. But the Harris campaign, as you pointed out earlier, in contrast to the Trump campaign, says that the RFK endorsement will not make a difference in these states. However, I think in a state like Michigan and Wisconsin, it's certainly notable that it is too late for RFK to get his name off the ballot.
And Jake, it is notable that the Harris campaign made their own statement reaching out to RFK Jr.'s supporters in the wake of him deciding to make this endorsement. We'll see what happens. Jake Rosen on the ground in Michigan. We appreciate you and your reporting. And finally tonight, a snapshot of a past social media sensation. On August 28, 2014, then President Obama addressed the nation while wearing a tan suit. Obama's style choice created an intense debate online about what presidents should wear in the summer. Obama that day updated the public on several pressing matters, including the fight against ISIS.
As Commander-in-Chief, I will always do what is necessary to protect the American people and defend against evolving threats to our homeland.
We've seen the tan suit in some social media memes ever since. It was even mentioned in Obama's final press conference as president.
I was sorely tempted to wear a tan suit today for my last press conference, but Michelle, whose fashion sense is a little better than mine, tells me that's not appropriate in January.
Some reporters were wondering if he'd show up at the convention in it. He did not. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.